speaker is Nicole Thompson-Gonzalez, and you can see what she's going to talk about right here. Refer to her website to find out more about her exciting research program. I just want to quickly announce the next two talks. Both of these are by Max Planck Institute speakers, so next week we have Carolyn Shipley. Again, both of these are just via Zoom, so we're not going to have food in the meeting room. Skill acquisition and life history towards a better understanding of cognitive evolution. So she'll mainly be talking about her long-term work on orangutans. And then Laurel Fogarty from the other MPI. So Carolyn's from the MPI for Animal Behavior in Constance. Laurel Fogarty will be talking about cultural rescue, avoiding extinction with gene culture coevolution. And so she is at Richard McElrath's group in Leipzig. So with no further ado, thanks. Nicole, start, and then please do join us for coffee afterwards to talk about her work some more.
It is wonderful to be here. Thank you so much, Susan, for the invitation, and Alexandria for helping organize so much. I'm excited to talk with you all today about how social paths can lead to health and fitness with the subtitle of There's No One Way to Do the Social Game Right. So I think that actually the subtitle is the main emphasis of what I'll be talking about today. So does this want to let me advance? There we go. All right. So since as early as the 1960s, medical and sociological research has shown that in humans, our cooperative and friendly ties, our relationships, matter a great deal to our health, discovering that over and over again for the last 60 years. So individuals that are more integrated in their social networks or have stronger or more reliable relationships are found to live longer, and they have lower incidences and better outcomes of all of the major diseases, most of the major diseases of contemporary human society, like dementia, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, autoimmunity, and frailty, something in old age. Sorry, I'm having trouble advancing. There we go. So being well integrated socially with good quality ties can lead to a mortality reduction that is as strong as quitting smoking and is greater than things like risk factors like obesity and physical inactivity. And as humans, we are completely on a spectrum, a continuum with other social animals. Sorry. Hi, Christine. It's just good to see you. We're on a continuum with other social animals in these effects of sociality on our health. So just starting on the social side, within groups, individual animals associate with their conspecifics often in non-random ways, particularly in mammals. So animals show preferences to share space, come into friendly contact with one another, and cooperate with particular partners, even those who are unrelated to them, just like we do. And in some species, like chimpanzees and baboons, dolphins and horses, those friendly relationships can last for years and years. And again, as in humans, for the last 20 years in animal literature, we've been finding that the quantity and the quality of these social ties, these social relationships, have been shown to correlate with fitness outcomes. So truly every picture on here isn't just pretty or cute, it represents a species where these links have been found. But a big question now, say for the last 5 years, is how do social ties actually end up influencing these outcomes across all these different kinds of animals? And back in 2019, I advanced this framework to just show these different pathways, many of which are behavioral, between cooperative social ties and fitness outcomes like reproductive success and survival or longevity. So you have things like cooperative ties being important for the communal care of offspring. Obviously, that can bolster reproductive success. Facilitates access to resources at a group level, the cooperation and territorial defense. Strong evidence for social ties allowing individuals to monopolize mates and resources, and also, in a related vein, achieving social status, so either maintaining their place in the hierarchy or advancing it. Social ties are also incredibly important for this pathway, lowering risk and maintaining homeostasis. And I'll be coming back and focusing here. But lastly, in this framework, social ties are super important during development to develop behavioral competence. So kind of an underappreciated pathway for the success later in life. And where I spend most of my time, there I am, is this pathway here. So lowering risk and maintaining homeostasis. And what this pathway really represents is how social ties influence health. And it might be perhaps one of the most pervasive and important pathways among all of these. I'll risk saying that just because none of these are mutually exclusive, and improving and maintaining health is something that is going to facilitate all of these other pathways at the same time. So yes, again, because health and fitness are not synonymous in any way, it is just one of these pathways by which ties can influence fitness. And so this framework does a nice job at highlighting some of the potential benefits of social relationships, but there are inevitably some costs. So for example, living socially and at close quarters obviously increases competition, always will. That comes with the risk of aggression and also disease transmission. And investing in some of these close long-term ties also it requires time and energy, so it leads to some opportunity costs, like time away from feeding, resting, and mating. So while there are many commonalities in the benefits and costs of ties across humans and animals, and these are important. Popular opinion generally has it that more ties, stronger ties, better integration, being more central in networks is better for different outcomes of health and fitness. There are lots of differences, and these differences are really telling in what does and what doesn't work. And rather than being noisy evidence of just a singular phenomenon, what I think we're finding when we find different pathways or different forms of social ties leading to different outcomes is that there's no one way to do this social game right. So we know that social ties, or this dynamic relationship between ties, health, and fitness, will vary over the life course. At each stage of life, we're presented with more or less unique, there are universal challenges across life, but at different life stages, we're presented with unique challenges and also unique opportunities for gain. Different advantages, say, to an individual during infancy than someone late in life. And we know really well that these relationships change in different ecologies. So socio-ecological models have dealt with this diversity for a really long time to understand how different ecological conditions shape social behavior. But I would just say that what we're focusing on here is this idea of these strong and long-term ties and how they can go on to benefit individuals and how ecologies are shaping that phenomenon specifically. So some of the questions that I'll be addressing today, or just some of the topics that I'll address today, I'm going to start with a study that I did a little while ago that just introduces this idea of different routes, different winning strategies. So it's a study of strong and stable ties influencing adult survival. That'll be in blue monkeys. I'll touch on some of the potential costs of those ties, and then I'll go on to focus on how aging can cause change in social ties. And let that feed into some of my future directions, talking about cross-species and cross-cultural drivers of social aging. So starting off with how might the benefits of, how do strong and consistent ties increase adult survival? And, So just some specific background about some of these species that strong ties have been shown to increase fitness in. This is either longevity or reproductive success. But you see strong ties in particular, so frequent interactions between two individuals over an extended period of time, influencing fitness in yellow baboons, chacma baboons, Assamese macaques, and rhesus macaques. So all of these are Cercopithecines, not distantly related to what I went on to determine whether strong and consistent ties have an influence on survival in. And these are blue monkeys that live in Western Kenya. This is really a great system for this question, particularly regarding adult females. So in these groups, you have a single male, multi-female social organization. Females stay in their natal group for life. They engage in cooperative territorial defense. So they have very little within group aggressive interactions. They do have stable dominance hierarchies, but it doesn't seem to mean a whole lot, according to other measures in previous research. They have a particularly long lifespan, even for a primate. So for an animal of their size, kind of a large house cat, they live for a very long time and have kind of protracted periods of development and infancy along with that. And thanks to marine accords and the people I'll thank on the next slide, there is excellent long-term behavioral and demographic data on this population. So I do want to stop and acknowledge who all contributed to the data for this kind of analysis, because I could have never done this on my own. And these are the people who maintain this ongoing site in Western Kenya. All right, so what did we do with this site? Walking you through a lot going on here. We had data on 83 females. Of them, there were 20 deaths. We used 2 to 8 years of social behavior per subject. And so overall, we had 496 subject years. And we measured 2 kind of basic issues of or descriptors of their social lives. So we looked at tie strength, and that is a dyadic sociality index, which is pretty popularly used, but it was a combination of grooming and resting in 1 meter, weighted more or less equally. And then we would find their top 3 or 6 partners using this dyadic sociality index. We would also look at the consistency in those top 3 partners from year to year. So overall, it would be the number of partners remaining in their top 3 in the following years, and we allowed for a 1-year gap. With these 2 measures, we divided females into 4 different social categories. So we would take the mean of strength or consistency, and then whether it was above or below, assign them according to that. So we had low strength, low consistency. Oh wow, that says the exact same thing. Shouldn't say that. High strength, yes, sorry, I'll edit that. But there were 4. Imagine a full factor design. And so we used the strength and consistency category in a Cox proportional hazards model, and we used 2 different kinds of hazards models. One to look at their average or their strength over all the years that they were observed and within a given year, the consistency of their partners in that year, had to be observed at least 2 years, or the consistency of those top partners over the whole time that they were observed. So single predictor variable of that social category. And then we also included other important things that would predict their risk of death. So kind of the morbid flip side of survival. So we had age at first reproduction. That was controlling for life history strategies. It could be live fast, die young, reproduce earlier, die earlier. So we wanted to factor that out and isolate the influence of sociality. We included their dominance rank because traditionally that higher rank should provide some advantages, especially for these females because it does correspond with priority of access to their best food. And also a different kind of competition, just group size. And we did find that the quality of ties with top partners mattered for adult female survival. What you can see here is a survival plot. So on the y-axis, you have percent of the total study population still alive at a given time or at a given age. And in these 4 different survival curves here, you see down here you have strong ties that are consistent, strong ties that are inconsistent, weak ties that are consistent, and weak ties that are inconsistent. all mapped along, showing how these individuals survived at different ages. And the first thing that you can see is that females with strong and consistent social ties had the highest survival in this blue line. Okay, that is consistent with the other Cercopithecine species that we've previously seen. The surprise, though, was that strong and inconsistent ties had the lowest survival. So strong ties in this very specific context where close partners were being cycled from year to year, those females were dying the youngest and actually had died on median survival of 13.5 years younger than a female who also had strong ties, but they were just consistent from year to year. When we compared between our summed, cumulative measures versus the annual measures, we did see an effect of strength and consistency on an annual basis, but it was much stronger when you considered the entire time that these females were observed. So we see that the negative effect of strong and inconsistent ties became even stronger over time. And just because a lot of, we tested between top 3 and top 6 partners, basically because it's become kind of a standard cutoff in a lot of sociality fitness studies and primates to just take top 3 partners, and we wanted to see if that actually meant something. And at least in this species, top 3 partners, it was more important than top 6. We didn't see the same effect in terms of the strength and consistency with their top 6. So what is going on here? Well, a few things. So like I showed, at least in baboons, you see that strong ties are universally beneficial for survival, both in males and in females. And you have just really evidence right now in these 2 other species where strong ties can actually potentially be harmful. And it's not to say that that baboons aren't really feeling a cost to maintaining their social ties. I think what's happening is that the benefits of social ties outweigh them in baboons. What do we have over here on the right? On the bottom is a distant relative, a yellow-bellied marmot. And we find that, or it's been shown that females who have stronger ties actually have a higher risk of death. So those who associate more with conspecific females are more likely to die within the year. And one thing about yellow-bellied marmots is that they're facultatively social, so they only live together when population density deems it necessary. They don't form coalitions or alliances to usurp resources or monopolize resources. Now, blue monkeys, they are not facultatively social. They are definitely highly social and live in well-defined groups and form and engage in territorial defense. But like I mentioned before, they don't have this within-group power structure so that they are forming coalitions to monopolize food. They are very spread out, and the only time that they are actually really aggressive is in territorial group defense, and that's really an entire group strategy. You don't just have dyads going in and defending their territory. So basically, it doesn't seem to be quite as much of a benefit to just maintain any kind of strong tie for a blue monkey, perhaps because there just isn't that same kind of payoff within the group. Now, personally, I kind of find that unsatisfying, and I wish I could follow up to see more about the biological basis of the costs of maintaining these strong ties, the costs of them not being consistent from year to year. Besides, the biological costs of it, it makes sense to me that they're not getting a return on investment. If the individual that they're investing a lot of time in this year is no longer within their proximity as often in the following. We do have some hint. Advance. We do have some hint of what those biological costs might be just from studies that I've done on the juveniles of this species. So one surprising thing that I found when I was looking at the physiological correlates of social behavior in the juveniles is that juveniles that groomed more had higher cortisol levels, which is the opposite effect of what you would expect. Really interestingly, I've learned that this same effect has been found in juvenile rhesus macaques in Cayo Santiago. So I don't think it's a one-off. Within this pattern, we could find that those individuals that groomed the most were the only, so if you broke it down into quantiles, the highest groomers were the only ones who significantly groomed non-kin more than kin. And although this was independent of age, what made sense, in my mind, what was happening is that these individuals, as they're getting older and grooming more, is they're having to establish, so particularly females, there's a sex difference in grooming in this species, particularly females are going to have to integrate themselves within this social group that they're going to have to cooperate with to defend their territory. And doing so spreading your network a little bit wider, will entail meeting up with folks that you're not as familiar with and having to get into situations where it's less predictable. And the way that this could relate to the adult females is that at least inconsistent partners in adulthood could come with some level of uncertainty and perceived risks. Now, I don't think that stress levels are just killing the adult females, but it goes to show that novelty in social interactions can also be a cost at some energetic level. So I'm going to return to this framework to focus more specifically on changes in social ties with age. And age is a really important but a tricky player in this overall relationship because it, of course, not only impacts social ties. It's a pervasive factor on health and physiology. I would say particularly during the periods of extreme change, which are during development and later in life during senescence. And that's where I'll focus. And for this question of how aging influences social ties or social integration, I'm moving one step closer to humans in our close relatives, chimpanzees. And I'm also taking more of a network approach. So I consider integration to represent your position within broader indirect connections, as well as direct ones. So I'll start off by going into a foray of patterns evident in human social aging. So older humans, their social networks typically shrink with age. And this does put them at risk of social isolation. And isolation is good for no one in any social species. So it's a major risk factor of morbidity and mortality. And I guess ironically, it's especially risky in older adults. So it almost seems like a counterintuitive strategy for older folks to associate less with individuals or have fewer individuals that they do regularly associate with. What is interesting in humans, and I think that this literature has become a lot more popular lately, the understanding of social selectivity. What's interesting in humans is that the focus in old age is usually on close and more emotionally fulfilling social partners. So it could be some kind of trade-off there. But I do want to add the caveat that this trend that is talked about as the human trend is really only evidenced in post-industrialized populations. So what you can see in these graphs, this is from Rizos and Bhattacharya. On each y-axis, you have the total number of social partners, what I'll later be calling just total degree. And in both of these studies, this is a meta-analysis on different Western populations. This is an analysis of an anonymous European country using phone records. But you can generally see that in early adulthood, there's a peak in the number of individuals in your social network, which gradually declines with age. And Bhattacharya has differentiated this by gender, showing that after early adulthood, the general trend is that women have larger social networks, direct context, than men do. But of course, that's the opposite, not of course, but you see it's the opposite in early adulthood. And there are a lot of good ideas about why that happens in terms of information gathering. So focusing on this decline with age, just to give you some background on the reigning explanations of human social aging. And the first is what I had briefly mentioned, is socio-emotional selectivity theory, which posits that the primary driver of this decline in social networks with age is our unique time perception, our ability to understand about our own mortality. That if we don't have a lot of life left, then we're not interested in learning and making novel connections. We're going to focus on what we have, and we want it to be positive and pleasant. Okay? That has been a prevailing theory for 30 years. There are also closely related theories, like the social convoy theory, which just I guess in sociology, the big emphasis here was just the time element of what friendships and partnerships are doing. So just this idea that we're traveling through life with a close set of supportive partners that can vary according to ego or individuals' attributes and in different contexts. And then there are a range of other cultural factors that people have posited are causing individuals to shrink their networks with age. So you have things that are external to them that they can't control, like ageism. Other things like geographic mobility. So in more market-integrated societies and in post-industrialized societies, you have individuals of a younger generation often moving away. And also retirement, which is one way of just switching your roles in life and leaving a certain kind of community. Okay, these are all ideas about what's happening to cause this pattern in humans. But we do see evidence for these declines in non-human primates. And these kinds of evidence leads us to believe that there's likely a deep evolutionary history to human social aging patterns. No doubt things like retirement and ageism play their role in influencing our social lives. However, there is something deeper going on here. I mean, there could be ageism in monkeys. We can talk about that. However, they don't have things like retirement. There isn't the same kind of geographic mobility. And there is not, arguably not, this understanding of their own mortality coming in the next few years. So what we see in Barbary macaques is the idea of, we see decreased social effort with age. Nice graphic here. So you have general social motivation. So individuals are maintaining their social interest, declining their social activity, and overall declining their levels of social exploration as they get older. And a different kind of trend that we see in chimpanzees, recently published in 2020, is that as individuals, so these are males, this is female, this is both sexes, I think. But in males specifically, and chimpanzees, as they get older, the number of their close partners, using a particular metric to say this is a close partner, they become more mutual. More of their close partners are mutual partners in old age. That means that they prefer this individual to associate with, and this individual prefers them. And you can see that the number of one-sided friendships, or these unrequited friendships, decline. So this is evidence of this improved relationship quality, which is also similar to what humans are doing when they get older, focusing on those close, emotionally fulfilling relationships. So the study that I'm going to tell you guys about was asking what are some of these more fundamental drivers of social aging patterns in chimpanzees. And our main ideas, I'll show them to you. Individuals could be experiencing increased constraints. This is kind of the obvious one about physical and cognitive decline because of senescence can constrain your ability to keep up with the group, to track social interactions, to climb up to where individuals are. There are changes in sociosexual status with age. So social and reproductive status can influence your priorities or vice versa. And that can bleed into how you're using social relationships. Say if your rank increases or decreases with age. For females, if their amount of time in estrus is changing because of reproductive decline, et cetera. And then this is kind of coming from audience effects. There can be changes in attractivity with age. So older individuals can be more or less socially attractive to other conspecifics. And you can think of it going both ways. Maybe the person you want to network with most is going to be someone who is younger and active and in the know. But an older person might also have a lot of knowledge and skill and perspective and wisdom about how to handle certain social situations. So there are ways that age can influence attractivity in both directions. Okay, so exploring those three drivers and what's causing social changes in chimpanzees, I'll first start off with what chimpanzees are like. If you didn't know, I feel like I've heard this 5 million times. But yeah, they live in multi-male and multi-female communities. And really a lot like us, they can really fluidly go from spending most of their day entirely alone to being in a big group of people, or individuals, excuse me. So they live in these fission-fusion social organization. Males stay in their natal group for life, and there's good evidence that they do physically decline with age. They experience things like muscle wasting and compensate for that by doing things like climbing less and have limited mobility. And these are the amazing people that I've worked with the chimpanzees. Have to give them a shout out. These incredible people are the ones who are really out in the forest day to day, doing an amazing job collecting incredibly detailed data. And these are some of the directors up here along with graduate students. It's been really nice to work with them. So for this analysis, we were looking at social network measures based on grooming interactions. And I wanted to use measures that were most relevant to human sociality and health. And I'll go through some of those step by step. And for this kind of analysis, we looked at males and females both together within networks and also separately, just because of their very distinct social lives, which we already expected. So the measures of integration that we used in grooming networks can just functionally be represented as things like attractivity. So this is in degree and in strength. So if anyone's unfamiliar with a sociogram, the individual of interest here is represented by the dark dot, and the clear circles are what we would call alters, who they could or could not be or are not connected to. And the tie between them is either directed or undirected, and here you see that this is behavior coming into ego. So in degree, in the sense of grooming, would just be the number of individuals that the number of alters that the ego receives grooming from. And in strength, in a related vein, is the total summed amount of time that it receives grooming from those other individuals. Just to reverse directions of out degree and out strength, this encapsulates the idea of social effort, so just how much they're investing in their social relationships themselves. Then you have betweenness, and this is just a matter of how many times does the individual lie between two other individuals in the group, a path, within the path between those individuals in a network. And this is thought to potentially be important to brokering information, to connect it to being a bridge or connecting different cliques of groups. I'm sure that Susan, being interested in cultural evolution and information transfer, is deeply familiar with these things. But betweenness is one of those things that's important for information transfer. Cliquishness, or otherwise called local transitivity, is just the probability that any two individuals that you are connected to are also connected with each other. And this is thought to be important. This is kind of a measure of how often are you hanging out in a clique. Now, it doesn't actually represent whether you're all hanging out together at the same time, but just in general that you've established a relationship among the three of you and the triangle is closed. And this is thought to be important for, in humans, for maintaining things like social norms, and could indicate something about the texture of life, because you could have a stronger potential of all being together at the same time. And then embeddedness is what I've called this measure of eigenvector centrality, which is a very popular network measure used. And the best thing to know about eigenvector centrality is that there are two ways to increase it. You can either increase the number of individuals that you are directly connected to, and or you can just be connected to individuals who have lots of connections themselves. So this is another one that's very important for information transfer and also disease transmission. And so this is just to show the range of life that we were able to cover with these individuals. So this is using focal follow data, using periods per individual between 1 and 10 years. And we were able to capture from the age when they become sexually mature pretty well into their old age, close to their maximum observed lifespan at this site. Oh, and there were 38 individuals, so 22 females and 16 males. And because I just don't expect anything to usually have a linear relationship with time, we use generalized additive models to model how some of these different factors related to aging, sociosexual status, and those two, aging and sociosexual status, how those related to different network measures for males and females. So for males, because we wanted to isolate the effect of aging, we're controlling for their dominance rank throughout, and also looking at effects of rank to see where rank potentially mediated an age effect by taking it out and putting it back in. For females, we predicted, we looked to see how age, rank, but also how their time swollen in a given year was influencing changes in their social integration with age. And so for that, we included an interaction between age and time swollen, because it's well known in chimpanzees that males are more attracted to older females than younger females, which I've always found to be both wonderful and mind-blowing. So the main trends that we see for males, and this is particularly in relation to their age, so age had this independent effect on these social measures, is that we saw a decrease in their attractivity with age. So this was the amount of grooming. They received less grooming from their male community members as they got older. In networks that included both males and females, you could see that males became more cliquish with age. So those individuals that they chose to associate with were much more likely to also be associates with one another. And you also saw that older males, whether you're just looking at males alone or in mixed-sex networks, that older males are more embedded in this measure of eigensector, according to this measure of eigenvector centrality, in old age than they are when they're younger. So it's not a linear increase. They seem to hit their peak embeddedness right around the time that is considered kind of the transition from prime to post-prime. But then they plateau. There's those individuals who go down a bit, but in general, it's just higher than when they're younger, despite their physical decline, and despite receiving less grooming from other males. For females, there weren't a lot of independent effects of age on female sociality. So I think one thing to say about females before anything else is that overall their levels of social integration were far lower than males. And I'll show you them in the same plot in a little bit. But what we do see is that older females spend less time grooming their adult community members as they get older. Now, I expect to be following up on this to see how their grooming with their dependent offspring are changing during this time, because I think that there could be that trade-off. But in general, females are holding to this idea of constraints, where you're getting older and you're putting less effort into your social relationships. For males, you don't see that same kind of constraint, even though they're aging. They show the same kinds of physical decline. But you do see things as if they are selecting their partners more judiciously, especially because they're receiving less attention from them. So, grainy. So we did also, as I said, look at some of the status factors and how they influenced aging. So this, on the y-axis, this is in degree, so the number of individuals that groomed a male. This clearly increases with rank. Again, kind of a plateau among the higher ranking males, but if you're a higher ranking male, then more other males are going to want to groom you. This isn't an all-male network. Not a huge surprise. They're basically sucking up to the bosses. And if I could show you a graph of how rank changes with age, you would see that it declines. I can't do that because Martin Muller might sue me. But rank is decreasing with age. And so this effect of rank on males' attractivity was actually mediating their decline in number of partners with age. So I didn't show that, but this is kind of lying in the background of males receiving less attention as they get older. Now for females, the dreaded interaction plot, what you can see here is that as you go to the right on age and you go towards the back on annual time swollen, that's when both of those increase. We see that the amount of grooming that a female receives is super high when she spends a lot of time swollen and she's older. So right in line with this idea of the older females being more desirable. You can see that. Now, why wouldn't that lead to, this actually didn't mediate just kind of a general trend of older females receiving more attention. And that's in part because older females spend less time swollen because of their reproductive decline. So younger females are swollen more often, but males just aren't as interested in them. So kind of shifting gears, but just to say some of the next steps that I'm really interested in doing to build off of this characterization of social changes with age is looking to see how these different trajectories could be related to health. So individual variation in trajectories related to markers of health that are relevant to aging. And so I previously validated these markers of oxidative stress in these animals to show that they're telling of things like infection and also related to aging, but only when they're very close to death. So generally good markers of condition, not necessarily biological age overall though. And what I'm interested to do is to take some of these aspects of their social environment. So this is broadly referencing all of the different strategies or potential strategies that I talked about just a second ago. Dominance rank, and also controlling for things like female reproductive effort to see if something about how they're aging socially is influencing some aspect of their health. And I expect that influence to come from some of these homeostatic pathways related to the immune system and energetics. So measuring things like inflammatory stress with a marker like neopterin, and looking at social and metabolic stress using cortisol. And basically with the idea that these might mediate any kind of damage to the individual in terms of their DNA, lipids, or their ability to protect and repair themselves. So that's to come. But in the meantime, I'd like to just return to patterns of social aging and talk a little bit more about how chimpanzees and post-industrialized populations compare. And I'll start with males. So how do male chimpanzees compare to men in these post-industrialized populations? Well, male chimps don't show the same extent of network shrinkage. I mean, I think it's beautiful that you can see this same bump in early adulthood as you see in humans, thought to be related to information acquisition. And there is a pattern of it decreasing with age. According to our analysis, this was not significant. As an aside, we were extremely conservative using permutation tests, which actually aren't commonly used in some of this social aging literature. But that's just a methodological aside. Anyway, this was not statistically significant. It is showing the same general pattern, but it's just not as extreme as men. And also, now, while we don't have a lot of, really, there's no direct evidence, to my knowledge, of how eigenvector centrality is changing with age in men, particularly from these populations. But what's suggested is that men are not embedded or central in information networks or social networks as they get older. But somehow male chimpanzees are able to sustain that and be more integrated than when they were younger and had this higher degree, right? And how do sex differences compare between chimpanzees and post-industrialized humans? So we see a reversed sex difference, and it's much larger in chimpanzees. So again, total degree here. And just looking at out degree in chimpanzees on the right, again, beautiful, similar hump early in life. But for the trend that is the majority of human life after early adulthood, or maybe child, family forming years in post-industrialized populations, females are not more integrated or have more social context than males in chimpanzees. It is strongly the opposite. And I think that we've known that for a long time in anthropology. And I think that a lot of literature that's been trying to get at, what is the ancestral social patterns between men and women in humans, I think a lot of that literature has just focused on kind of different age windows to say, sociological literature has shown that women are always more integrated than men or have more social contacts than men. But look, we studied individuals at this age range, and it contradicts that, and it's more similar to chimpanzees, so that's our ancestral condition. So I think a life course perspective is extremely valuable in just getting down to what's actually going on. I hope that actually made sense. So one thing that aside was kind of meant to emphasize is that I don't think that we have a really strong understanding of social aging patterns in humans broadly. So one thing that I am humbly calling for is a cross-cultural comparative perspective on social aging. So, and just some amuse-bouches of why this could be very cool. So limited evidence does suggest that extreme network shrinking in humans is not universal. So for men of the Chimane in Bolivia, Nyangatom in Ethiopia, you see men maintain political influence and integration into old age. Now, not at the same levels as a man in his prime, but seemingly better than in post-industrialized societies. We would need the direct evidence to really make that comparison. And as for women, after early adulthood, they're not always more socially integrated than men. It really depends on the context, the type of social interaction, and the context of local power structures and gender roles. So one example of this kind of extreme context dependence is in the Moso women in the Yunnan and Sichuan provinces in China. In patrilineal Moso communities, they're a great natural experiment. They have both patrilineal and matrilineal communities that live in somewhat close geographic range to one another, slightly different environmental settings, but more or less similar cultures, just different modes of wealth inheritance. So in the patrilineal Moso, women have smaller social networks than men, on average. And you flip that around into it's the opposite in matrilineal communities. So a simplification, but a taste of how these gender differences are highly fluid. So, and part of this call, again, I'm looking for a comparative perspective, is to have greater representation of other ape species and truly other non-human primates that are appropriate. But most directly in relation to chimpanzees, female bonobos are clearly more social and more cooperative than female chimpanzees are. But because of the extreme logistical difficulties of where they live and the political situation surrounding where they live, there's relatively little information or examination on their social changes with age. But it would be fascinating to know, basically, if they're showing the exact opposite patterns of chimpanzees, or maybe their females are maintaining just the same levels of integration into old age as males are. And that could simply be because of a higher energetic availability, and also just the importance of their cooperative relationships sustained into later life. So to just pull it together, I'm just starting this summer, Socioecology of Social Aging Working Group. And I'm bringing together human and ape researchers who have this long-term behavioral data on individuals to examine the influence of really a range of socioecological factors on changes in social ties and network integration into age. And these are really difficult, these different topics of these ecological and social factors. It's difficult to distill them to a single bullet point. But the kinds of things that would be interested to understand in relation to patterns of social aging are basic things like social organization and gender norms, roles in childcare, which I think places a huge constraint on something like female chimpanzees, the roles of prestige and power and how that changes with age and how that influences social ties, things like geographic mobility. And also, it would be really wonderful to understand more about what the constraints on sociality really are. So if and when possible, looking at physical decline and how that relates to activity levels and interaction. And I can imagine you might be wondering, why does this matter? So why do cross-species and cross-cultural comparisons of social aging actually matter? And it comes back to the idea of there's no one way to do the social game right. So there are myriad ways to age well, and successful interventions and policies in human societies are not going to be one size fits all, and they currently pretty much are. So I think that this kind of insight, while it doesn't have to be directly applied, it can be good basic science, I think it's highly valuable for social gerontological research and policy interventions today. So with that, thank you so much to all of my mentors and colleagues and trainees who helped with all this data, and to all of you, happy to take some of your questions.
Could you repeat their questions in
Sure.
Zoom for the Zoom audience?
This is a fantastic talk. Thank you so much. I actually have two questions. The first one is about the monkey project at the beginning. I was wondering if you have any thoughts about what might be contributing to why some of the monkeys are choosing these different strategies, like why they might be doing consistent relationships, or maybe not consistent, strong relationships, like maybe are their partners dying, is it a personality thing, is it a social relationship thing? So I was wondering your thoughts on that. And then I can wait for my second question.
Okay. What's your name?
My name is Nat.
Nat?
Yes.
So Nat just asked, what are my thoughts? Do I have any thoughts on what causes the female blue monkeys to choose different social strategies or end up having these different social profiles, like consistency and strength? I have thought that it does have something to do with personality. I've also thought that it has, there are issues of luck and poor choices. I don't know, I don't think that we have a really clear understanding of adult female social preferences outside of kin preferences. But I could imagine that an individual, like a female, could kind of like place her chips on the wrong bet and start to try and invest in an individual that actually was just already close with some other folks and didn't reciprocate. I think in general, especially for the profile where they maintain weak ties with rapid turnover from year to year, I feel like that's a personality thing. I think just anecdotally on the ground that we would know individuals as being social butterflies and not. And because I saw more of that, and I saw more of these, you could just anecdotally see more of these individuals who, they were more noticeable individuals who like always had their people from year to year. I don't know, I could imagine that this is like probably too much of a speculation, but it does seem like that's, based on the results, those are the evolutionary stable strategies. There wasn't actually a huge discrepancy in the number of individuals that populated these different groups, but strong and inconsistent was the smallest. So a better answer to that is I really don't know why they're doing these different things, but.
My second question is, I really agree with your perspective, like looking more in bonobos and seeing if there's like differences there, but then there's difficulties, of course, with actually working with bonobos in the wild. Do you think it'd be valuable to maybe investigate some of these questions in captive bonobos? Or if there would be like significant downsides to that, or maybe aspects of social relationships that you can't see in captive individuals?
I think if there are captive individuals who have been observed for a long time, then that's an advantage. I think that chimpanzee and bonobo social behavior is really flexible to their context. So I would be really wary. I would kind of want to do a lot of due diligence to see if there are extreme differences between the bonobo social behavior in captivity versus what we know of in the wild. And I think I would rather, I would prefer to move forward with the cross-sectional and limited data that we might have from wild populations. But I think that, when in a pinch, captive populations could be really useful. Thank you. Yeah.
Great talk. That was really fun. I'm working with the marmots now and starting a postdoc with Lauren in the fall, and we think about like group size a lot and how that influences with Lauren. Yeah.
Okay, nice.
With how group size influences the network measures, but how might group size as a like social opportunity or social potential influence aging? I've never really, aging's beyond my scope, so I'm curious on how group size might influence how you think about aging.
Well, maybe, so what was your name?
Connor.
Connor just asked, well, he shared with us the great news that he's going to be doing a postdoc with Lauren Brent on marmots, but asked about how group size might be influencing aspects of aging. Well, I think that the most obvious tie that I can think of is how, well, group size, when you don't have the proportional increase in territory, then you have higher population density, which increases competition. So in those situations, you might end up with more haves and have-nots. So there's a potential for there to be more disparate aging trajectories among a larger or like a denser population. Or it could just, influence everyone across the board. But the tie or the pathway that I would think of is just how resource availability would influence physiology and fewer resources to doing different things that would be repairing. And it would be interesting. We have this idea. There is this predominant idea that caloric restriction is good, but in natural settings, it's usually a detriment because they already kind of live in a caloric restricted natural environment. But it would be interesting to see how they compensate for things like being able to invest in repair, and whether they might slow down reproduction to be able to do that better, or they would just go hard and fast, reproduce while they can. And that would mean that they age faster. That's what I would expect. Brian.
I really enjoyed your talk and the comparative perspective and all the great network measures that you presented, and especially also that there was so much long-term data there. That's really, really great. I was wondering, kind of following some of the threads that you presented in your talk, whether, perhaps just an open-ended question, like what do we know about social network structures during acute times? Like, for example, you mentioned how social networks are influenced by reproductive state of females, the amount of time they spend swallowing. One of the costs of sociality, of course, is disease transmission. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, what do we know about how social networks structure during, for example, outbreaks of respiratory diseases or other kinds of real critical times, like when an individual is injured, for example. Is there any sense coming from or data that suggests that non-human primates are aware of or responding in ways that can be reflected in the social networks?
So I'm not sure how to summarize that for Zoom land.
Well, do social networks change when chimps, let's say, or blue monkeys are sick or injured?
Yeah.
And does that factor into the costs of the relationship between fitness and sociality?
Okay, so Brian just asked how are networks influenced by things like injury and sickness, and how could that relate to the relationships between sociality, health, and fitness. So I think that you're bringing up, there are probably a lot of points within this point, but one thing that seems really important to address is that the arrow that I drew between sociality and health is not a one-way street at all. And you see that especially when you start talking about aging, because it's influencing health, but also influencing sociality. Health is a constraint, or like poor health is a constraint. And then there are different ways of talking about how health will influence sociality. So you have kind of like the internal factors of, well, I just don't have the energy or the mobility to actually go to where these individuals are, therefore that confines me. But the other point that you bring up is super interesting about, social avoidance, essentially, and kind of has to do with that idea of, attractivity. And I know people have done research on this, but I can't bring myself to remember the exact points because it's not super well understood. I think that what seems most obvious, so one, it's really hard to tell when an animal is sick. It can be very hard to tell. Even if you use kind of biological measures, it's hard to line up, like, oh, they're in an inflammatory state. Are they getting over what they had a week ago, kind of thing. But I think, and this is just kind of anecdotal, that in general individuals will isolate themselves if they have something like a visible wound. You know, it's really similar to just being physically incapacitated in old age, to not put yourself in a situation where you could risk further injury. So yeah, I think that it does have those acute short-term effects. At the same time, because this has been a really important point to understand the influence of like social ties on something like mortality, in humans, they've been exceptionally good at controlling for initial health status to see how social ties actually ends up predicting health. And it usually does so regardless of your initial health status. So even though health is probably influencing ties and sociality in a number of ways, it does seem that like regardless of that relationship going on, certain levels of like certain quantity or quality of ties is still improving outcomes in the long term. So it's a secular process or a cyclical process. Thanks for that. Yeah.
Yeah, throughout your talk, I kept thinking of this concept in the human realm of introversion versus extroversion.
Yeah.
And you know, thinking about introverted people, it suggests that the right social game is very individual based, and perhaps sometimes a highly social lifestyle is not the healthiest. Does that hold up at all in non-human species, or how do you think about that in the context of other animals?
I think it's been something kind of on my to figure out list. In terms of the biological basis of introversion and extroversion, I know that there's research on that and different levels of or quantity of dopamine receptors, that basically introversion's cup is just filled faster. Their social cup is just like, I'm good, done, versus extroverts. And I'm not sure how that same, you know, what little I know about how that works on a biological level in humans, how much that's happening. You know, among primates who are all of the same sex and kind of reproductive strategy. You know, I mean, if you looked at something like a male blue monkey, he spends most of his time alone, and it's an incredibly boring lifestyle, but he doesn't really depend on social relationships for much. He just has to take over a group and then be the resident. I think I'd like to think about that more. But yeah, I think that animal personality is, I mean, it's just harder to get at than I think for humans in general. But thanks for your question. Yeah.
I had a question, sorry. Great talk, by the way, thank you, trying to speak. The study that you showed with the blue monkeys, I had a couple questions just on some of the results or maybe analyses that you did or didn't do. You mentioned that you had controlled for life history strategy by including age at first reproduction in the hazard model.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you found a relationship between age at first reproduction and earlier mortality.
It's a good question. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to say that there was no relationship between age at first reproduction and mortality.
And then I have one more follow-up question. You also said that the juveniles who do more grooming have higher cortisol.
Yeah.
But I was wondering about those who received the grooming. What were their cortisol levels like?
You know what? It held up both as like an aggregate measure of grooming received and given, and then grooming given and grooming received. Or sorry, like separately. So like all three showed the same kind of relationship with, so yeah, I'm being general when I say cortisol, you know, fecal glucocorticoid metabolites. So something akin to native cortisol. Oh, I have, okay, there's one question here. Did I answer that?
You did, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll read this question from Zoom. It's from Fernando Soleil. Amazing, thank you. Thank you. About the positive relation between grooming and cortisol levels. Does increased cortisol levels lead to more grooming, or is cortisol released when engaged in grooming? This is the fine-scaled data that reviewer number 2 really wanted to have too. So the thing is, so what we're doing, what we did in this study, thank you for your question, Fernando. I wish I knew. But in general, so here, to rephrase this question, is it cortisol before and then they decide to groom? Because that kind of aligns with our perspective that, oh, yeah, grooming is a really relaxing strategy to potentially regulate HPA axis responses, return back to baseline, get all those good oxytocin anxiolytic effects. If that were the case, then grooming would be associated with lower cortisol. I mean, just the way that things are summed over an entire month of like, this is their deviation from their individual baseline of cortisol in this month, and this is how much grooming they were doing throughout the month. And we have sampled, we've created that average FGC level by sampling them throughout that period of time, congruent or contemporaneous with when we're sampling their social behavior. If grooming were doing its thing that we expected to lower stress levels, then they wouldn't constantly have this positive relationship with each other, is what I would expect. Let's see, is there something else? Or is cortisol released when engaged in grooming? So if and I still dream about this, I think about this. If I were to go back and do new research on the Kakamega blue monkeys, then I would definitely be measuring getting urine samples from them, and fecal when I could, after grooming bouts, before and after grooming bouts, to actually get that fine scale data, because the data that we have, they're not paired in a way that we can actually tell how much it's actually being released because of a grooming interaction. But thanks for the encouragement that I should go back to Kakamega. You're welcome. Are there any other questions? These have been wonderful questions. Thank you. Good.
Mine for later.
Okay. Yeah, you get lots of time with things.
Yeah, I do. Any more?
In the, well, I'll say.
Sure.
Do you have any, I know you're just getting started at UCSB, but do you have any like workshops or anything like that coming up with the cool
The Aiden
group that you described of the
So
social
we have some core people right now, and I'm still looking to expand that core group, planning group, and we'll be meeting over Zoom throughout summer, and then planning a workshop for the spring. So hopefully spring of 24. We'll be able to host people in Santa Barbara and have, it'll be available on Zoom to see a day of talks and then some roundtable discussion. If you're interested in social aging, Brian, you're welcome.
And interested.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Good to see you, Clark. I didn't get to say hi before. I'll
Thanks
see
for
you
the
in a
talk.
couple of weeks at HFest.
Definitely.
It's my first HFest.
Cool. Everyone should come.
Awesome.